Hello, welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today we're going to be doing the Team Longsword Finals event from AGO that just happened last weekend. And normally I wouldn't be starting with the Team Relay Finals, but that is the only one that I got good footage of so far because the AGO live stream kind of died a little bit towards the end of the day. But if you don't already know what it is, a team relay is basically a match of a team of longsworders who act as a kind of single unit in terms of life points. So basically the way it works is that, at least in this final match, every single individual person would have 8 points that once was scored against them, they would switch out for the next person in line, and every team had 3 members in ascending order of HEMA rating. So basically, what we have here is Derek Ray versus Jeff Will as our first 2 Pokemon to do battle, and then once one of them scored 8 points, they then swapped out for the next person in line with their team. Cool, makes sense, great. So obviously there were a lot more exchanges than I'm going to be able to cover, but I'm going to try to take the key points from each one, but also talk a little bit about what makes Team Longsword so fun, because as a unique event, it's really, really nice to see a bunch of people who got defense together who would normally never get to, and also it kind of gives you a little bit of that open longsword feeling back, which has started to go away a little bit with the introduction of tiers. Now you have people who are on completely different levels, fencing each other, representing their team, representing their longsword school, and having a lot of fun. So, unfortunately, our cameraman was trying to do something really special and unique and tried for some low camera angles for the majority of this Jeff Will versus Derek Ray matchup. And unfortunately, what that camera angle resulted in was a whole lot of nice shots of the AGO sweatpants merch that they were selling at the venue, and not really so much of the fencing. But eventually, he did manage to switch to an over-the-head view, which resulted in a lot better camera angles. But again, most of this first fight was kind of lost. So what we have here is the one really good exchange that we got on camera, and it is still an interesting exchange to break down. Jeff comes in with a little bit of forward pressure, throws a feinted cut on the right side that he scallops underneath, and throws an undercut to the hands. The exact same time, recognizing this, and instead of going for a parry, Derek throws a big shot over the top, but finds that he is still not quite in time enough to land that shot within a tempo. Now, one thing to talk about with the rules here are that this was a fully weighted afterblow, but no afterblow rule set. And if that doesn't make any sense, it means this. There were only doubles, no afterblows, and you got the points of whatever you managed to land. So, in this theoretical scenario, Jeff Will comes in with that hand shot. He would get 1 point no matter what. And then it would be Derek's job to make sure that within one tempo, that means no time spent trying to parry or re-maneuver or re-chamber, he has to then land something to the head in order to get 2 points rather than 1 point. There would be no deduction. There would be no 1 point from the 2 point. He only gets 1 point. And part of the reason for this is that they wanted these sort of engagements to go quickly so that you could get to the 8-point minimum that would require you to switch out the other fencer. Now, again, this was a clean 1 point for Jeff because even though Derek got really, really close to landing that follow-up headshot, he didn't do so within one tempo, and so his headshot was discarded. And then, of course, we had Derek switch out for Brandon Zipplinger, and we watched a couple of exchanges between Jeff and Brandon. So one of the themes you're going to see throughout these exchanges is the theme of trying to take control of the center line. And in this exchange, both fencers try to throw a single technique that is really dominant at controlling that center line. Jeff Will throws a Shielhao with the short edge plunging down, and Brandon throws a Zornhao, a more 45-degree angled cut from the top right quadrant. And the interaction between these two is very important to understand, because one of the aspects that makes the Shielhao so strong is that it can access these high priority targets very quickly, very efficiently, and it can both cut and thrust. But one of the problems with the Shielhao is that if you do miss that technique, or it does get contested in the middle, the Zornhao has a much stronger structure and a much more likelihood of being able to force the Shielhao out of that center line, control of which is what both of these fencers are looking for. So when the initial clash of these first two techniques happens, no one really gets anything. But the follow-up goes in the favor of Brandon very heavily because his Zornhao did a much better job of pushing the hands of Jeff off to the left side and giving him access to the lower right quadrant that Brandon throws a right Zverkow into. This gives him a clean access to a high priority target, while Jeff now has the problem of realizing that since he has now lost the center line, he has to either go for a low priority target, which will only get him 1 point, or trying to parry, which he probably isn't going to be able to get there in time to do. So now we have the tier 2 fencer of both teams. We have the tier 2 fencer of Bucks, which is Henry Reynolds, and the tier 2 fencer of Columbus, which is Brandon Zipplinger. And we've always seen a little bit out of Brandon for his ability to seize the center line and go for those high priority targets. But Henry fences a little differently. He's left-handed. He likes to go for hand shots, keep his distance, keep his timing, and go for parry riposts where applicable. And I believe that Brandon already had a bit of a strategy in place for this. As you can see by the exchange, Brandon comes in feinting the idea that he's going to go for his big, deep Zornhouse straight to the head again, and we see Henry immediately throw up his hands and throw up a very strong guard just for that attack. However, Brandon has thrown a feint in this direction and has now pivoted to a lower right Zverkow. However, a key thing to pay attention to here is just how high that low Zverkow really is. It comes in right at the basic top of the shoulder of Henry, and then you can see Brandon, after he lands the shot, throws his hands up even higher into a kind of high left hanging parry in order to make sure that he was protecting the high priority targets that Henry could have theoretically gone for rather than try to parry. The idea here is that by throwing a feint, Brandon was taking a pretty calculated risk. The risk was that Henry wasn't going to throw something straight at his head right at the forefront. But even if that was what ended up happening, or Henry tried to counterattack to the head, Brandon still threw this right Zverk in such a way that it was protecting most, if not all, of his high priority targets, giving him the best chance of victory at both landing his attack and making sure he didn't get doubled to a higher priority. On our next exchange, we have a pretty classic offense versus defense exchange. We have Brandon coming in with an absolute flurry of blows, throwing one attack after the other, almost always going for the high line, and making sure that Henry has to defend himself, otherwise he has to let one of these through, applying an immense amount of pressure not only along that center line, but to the guard itself of Henry, trying to lever himself a position where he can finally get a clean strike in. Henry showcasing his defensive capabilities in parrying these shots one after the other, trying to get the better of one of these parries so that he finally finds himself in a position where he can repost cleanly. And the end result is eventually Brandon manages to mount enough pressure to crack the defense of Henry and get one last parting hand shot on the way out. Now, one of the things that I say a lot on this channel is that if you had to choose between defense and offense, you should probably pick offense. But one thing to also be clear of is that being offensive doesn't necessarily mean that you're always attacking, and it doesn't always mean that you're always attacking with intent to hit. When you watch very closely at a lot of these attacks that Brandon throws, you can see that a lot of them are just trying to get Henry into a pattern of parrying left, right, over and over again, and throwing just enough spice on these attacks to make sure that Henry has to put up a real parry rather than something that he can just kind of throw out there and then quickly riposte from. By putting an immense amount of pressure and physical force into these attacks, Brandon throws a risk of getting parried one really good time and being in a position that is not good for a follow-up attack. So you have to kind of cut the difference between throwing something with enough power to actually land or crush through a guard, or something with so little power that it can be very easily parried. And Brandon splits that difference expertly. He throws every single attack on a line where it has to be parried, just enough force so that Henry's guard is kind of crushed towards his head, ensuring that Henry doesn't have enough space or time in order to throw a proper riposte. And this gives Brandon all the opportunity he needs to eventually batter down the guard of Henry and expose an opening. Now, Henry Reynolds, despite what I just showed you, did manage to get the better of Brandon Zipplinger and pulled out the final fencer of the Columbus team, Trevor Pettersson. And here in this exchange, despite the fact that it doesn't get called quality, is one of the things that makes Trevor so effective as a longsword fencer, his distance and timing. Now, one thing that you'll notice here is that both fencers are moving in and out, trying to get a feel for where their distance is and what the timing of the other person is, and it's Trevor who finds that distance and timing first. Henry takes a small but critical step into range and does not throw an attack. And this triggers a massive lunge and thrust from Trevor. And this is, in a lot of ways, the perfect time to execute an attack like this. Because when your opponent has just taken a step forward and has still got a little bit of their momentum going forward, but they're just about to stop it, the next thing that you can always expect they're going to do is to move backwards. And this means that while moving backwards, they're probably not going to attack. So this is the perfect opportunity to throw a really deep, really committed attack because one, you know that your opponent has just moved into range and is about to move out of range but hasn't been able to yet. And if you can overcommit or commit very far forward with a big explosive attack, you're not only going to catch them flat-footed, you're going to catch them as they're moving backwards and guaranteed to defend. So Trevor, when he throws his big explosive thrust, throws a little bit of a feint on the dominant side of Henry, which pulls his guard over to Henry's left side, opening up a target on Henry's right side, which Trevor immediately lunges deep for. And again, he doesn't quite make it there, but you can see here how this was, at the end of the day, a completely free attempt on the side of Trevor for some clean points. This is the key execution of distance and timing that's going to become very important in the next matchup, which everybody's been waiting for, Trevor Pedersen and Stephen Chaney. So we're down to our final two fencers, and what we see in this exchange is a pretty critical mashup of some of the meta that we've been seeing in some of the previous exchanges with the previous fencers. Namely, a blend between this dominating the center line mentality and the distance and timing execution that we saw in just the previous exchange. So we know what triggers Trevor's big explosive footwork. And here we see Stephen Chaney trying to bait it out a little bit. I say bait it out because what we see is Stephen Chaney come forward with just a little bit of tiny footwork and not attack, which is, as I said earlier, the exact trigger that makes Trevor go into attack mode. However, I say bait because at the end of the day, the footwork that causes this attack is not very large, and theoretically, as we can see from the footage, Stephen Chaney is already beginning to move backwards the second Trevor is attacking, which is very different from what we saw against Trevor and Henry. So Stephen Chaney has a little bit of an advantage here in that he's already starting to move backwards as Trevor throws his big attack, but Trevor immediately adapts by throwing what's called a delayed attack. The idea here is that as Trevor is moving through the air, he has his hands up, ready to throw that strike downward, but does not throw it yet. Instead, as he's traveling across with his big step, he is simply waiting for an opportunity to throw that attack that seems a little bit more likely to succeed. And he gets his feedback when he sees that Stephen Chaney, while moving backwards, starts to immediately throw an attack on a 45-degree angle. This is a critical piece of feedback because what you know now is that if you come straight down the middle, completely vertical, you're going to dominate that center line, and it's going to come down to a little bit of luck and a little bit of force in order to make sure that your downward cut completely shoves your opponent's 45-degree angle cut out of the way and keeps you safe while you land your big hit to the top of the head. But it doesn't quite work out that way. A little bit of that extra distance that Stephen Chaney bought himself with his very small footwork and very explosive batwork movement gave him just enough space to land his own shot to the head of Trevor just as Trevor comes down with that vertical strike. So even though Trevor did everything he probably could have done in order to protect himself while simultaneously delivering the strike, it just wasn't quite enough, and the result is a double. But remember, double means 2 points for everybody, and we inch one step closer to this match being done. Now, there are two key interactions in this exchange that need breakdown. And the first is this hand shot from Trevor, or at least this attempted hand shot from Trevor. And we see here is a very unique way of executing a hand shot that you don't see a lot of other people do. So what we see here is, again, a little bit of a footwork trigger. Stephen Chaney moves into range. Trevor throws a little bit of a feinted cut that triggers Chaney to throw a hand shot of his own. Trevor tries to deflecting parry this off to the side and then seize the initiative and go for a almost kind of parry riposte hand shot here with a really deep lunge and a weird dragging cut sort of thing towards his opponent's hands. Now, what are the benefits of this? One of the aspects that makes hand shots so difficult sometimes is that when you go for them, you often have to throw your shot where you know the hands are going to be and not necessarily where they are, because hands move around a ton, especially after your opponent just threw a hand shot and you know they're going to lower them, try to pull them close to their body and keep them safe. So by throwing a dragging cut that basically goes through the full arc and then, yes, hits the floor, what you're basically making sure of is that the arc of your cut covers every single possible location that your opponent's hands can be in, including all the places they can be in if they try to pull down or closer to their torso. This gives you a really good shot of not only hitting the hands, but possibly, if you're lucky, maybe even the leg if they leave it out there a little too long. So it's a pretty great execution, but there are some flaws. One being that one of the reasons that people go for really shallow hand shots when they do this is because they want to bounce off of their target and put their sword back in a position where they can defend themselves from any kind of afterblow. But again, remember, there are no afterblows in this format, so you're free to sort of go for as deep a cut as you can possibly make. So long as you don't get doubled on the way in, you're going to get your points and you're going to get them for free. But that's not what ends up happening here. It looks like from the slow-mo footage here that Trevor's sword basically barely makes any contact with Stephen Chaney's hands, and the simple lack of momentum from both Stephen Chaney lowering his hands and moving backwards out of the way means that it just didn't make enough contact to make a good glove noise and just ended up hitting the floor much harder than it ended up hitting hands, so it is not called. However, when they come back together, we see another interaction that I already talked about, this dominance of the center line. Trevor throws the Shield this time, and it is now Steven who throws the big Zornhau, big kind of vertical cut straight down the middle. And we once again see that even though both fencers manage to hit each other in the head, the dominance of that center line is going to come into play if and at any point they manage to completely zone out their opponent and get a clean 2 points. Something that is a little bit of foreshadowing for the exchange to come. So we come now to the final exchange, and we finally get a little bit of a resolution on our dominating the center line meta that we've been seeing throughout all of these exchanges with all of these different fencers. We finally get an exchange where one of these fencers throws something straight down the middle and manages to zone out the opponent's sword, which was also trying to go straight for their head. And we get that from Stephen Chaney with a really nicely executed Shield. So if you don't already know how a Shield is supposed to work, generally what you're trying to do is you're trying to meet your opponent right in the middle, right down the center line, right where you're both trying to be, and you basically push your opponent's blade out with the strong of your own, with your thumb against the shield, and just get it out of that way while you deliver a cut straight down the middle. But that's not how Stephen Chaney executes this Shield. He had tried to do this previously and it didn't quite work out because, as it turns out, if you take enough of an angle and you go in with enough force, it's entirely possible to go around somebody's Shield and hit them even through the strong of that blade and just basically come in at a slight angle and get to your target. Chaney was on both ends of this before, where he both tried to stop Trevor with a Shield and both tried to get around Trevor's own Shield with some Zornhaus of his own. So what he did to make an adjustment and to make sure that this worked was two key things. One, he moved his entire body off to his right so that his left side coverage was significantly more behind his sword, and he popped his left elbow and his left arm out just a little bit extra, almost to the point where it would pivot a little bit towards a left Zverkow rather than a left Shield. But the idea here is that, one, if you're moving your body away from your target and you're moving your sword into where your target is attacking, you're giving yourself the benefit from both sides. You're both taking away the target that your opponent is shooting for, and you're putting your sword in the way so that it stands to cover a lot more of your body. And it both happening in the exact same time means that it happens twice as fast. Since Trevor's attack is extremely fast, you're going to need that if you're going to be able to zone it off to the side. But the other key thing to pay attention to here is the fact that the interaction of the blade doesn't happen until Chaney has already more or less made contact with the point of his sword. This is an important thing to consider because one of the aspects that can make Shield so effective is that oftentimes you end up meeting in the middle right before you then drop the point down onto your opponent's head. But that can't really happen here because if you were looking for that bind before you manage to reach your target, there's significantly higher chance that you end up getting doubled, as Trevor's attack clearly had so much force and so much structure to it, it was still almost able to blow through the defense of Chaney after he had managed to land his attack. So this popping of the left arm And this movement to the right side coincidentally basically made the angle of the Shield almost a 45-degree angle from the target to Cheney's left hand, creating almost a hanging parry style scenario where there was so much blade to go through, and the only thing that you could really reach once you went through it was arm. He set up a scenario where he could hit his opponent, make sure to get that parry off as best he could, but even if it didn't end up working out for him, the chances of Trevor's attack going through to his head was significantly reduced, and his arm was significantly increased, which, of course, as we know, given that you can double and get a 2-point and a 1-point on the same exchange, that was more than enough to get Cheney the final points he needed to win and to finally resolve once and for all this team relay fight. So, we have a lot that was broken down here. We have a lot of really cool fights. And the best part is that this isn't even the first time that this team fought each other in this team relay event. It was a double elimination bracket, which means they fought each other 3 times. So if you want to see more of that, hopefully there's going to be some footage up of the team relay finals later that isn't so bugged down with the glitches that AGO had. And of course, I'm going to be showing some other stuff from AGO later on this week, and hopefully some more finals breakdown again as soon as I get the footage. So, hope to see you on Thursday, and I hope you like the video.